Hey everyone. Our lesson today is going to be on organic functional groups and families, where we're going to take a look at identifying different functional groups on molecules, which are basically a collection of different atoms that are going to be attached to a larger organic or hydrocarbon chain. Then we'll take a look at how we can name a few of these different molecules, representative molecules from different families. And we're going to be using our reference tables quite heavily for this, as there's a lot of information in table R, which we'll be using, including some of the naming information for sample molecules. So this is a relatively straightforward lesson. There is a lot to cover though, so I'm going to try and move as quickly as I can so you're not left with a really long video to try and get through here. So up to this point, we've talked about hydrocarbons, branched hydrocarbons, with different methyl ethyl groups on there. Halocarbons, we have halogens attached to a hydrocarbon backbone. And there are several other families of organic compounds which we would call functional groups that we can add to other hydrocarbons to further differentiate different molecules. And functional groups are groups of atoms that are in particular positions that are going to give the molecule special properties. And sometimes, depending on where the functional group is located, is going to determine what type of family that molecule is part of. So reference table R lists the different functional groups that make up the different families of organic compounds. These are the ones that you'd have to be responsible for. And a lot of these will look quite similar, which are going to have, some of them will have the same functional group, but as I said before, it's just going to be in a different location. So here in table R, we have all of our, 9 different functional groups. And the second heading here gives you what the functional group looks like. The general formula shows you how that or where that group might be attached. Sometimes we see it in between two different parts of a chain. Sometimes we'll see it at the end. And the R here is indicating some type of bonded atom, or potentially a group of atoms or part of another chain. So for example, the organic acid, this shows that the carboxyl group COOH is going to be bonded at the end of a chain. And that's what we see here in the condensed formula. It's going to be at the end of the molecule. And some of these, depending where they're located, are going to determine what family the molecule is a part of. For example, aldehydes and ketones have the same, or what looks like the same, functional group. But the aldehyde is going to be on the end. That's why we have the hydrogen attached here as well. And the ketone is going to be in the middle, somewhere in the middle of a large chain. So alcohols, we've already talked about halides as a class of functional groups in our previous lesson. So we'll start here with alcohols. Alcohols are hydrocarbons that have a substituted hydrocarbon as their functional group. The hydroxide group makes the molecule polar. So alcohol is a polar solvent. So the OH is covalently bonded and does not actually dissociate or separate from the parent molecule. So it's not considered a base. Remember, O, it's a base. So the alcohols are not a base because that OH does not separate or dissociate. Now, naming alcohols is just like any other hydrocarbon. The suffix of the name is going to be OL, so that's what the ending is going to get. And so we get alcohol, all. And the position of the OH group on the chain is indicated by the lowest numbered carbon. For example, 1-propanol, we can break this down. Prop meaning 3 carbons, the all meaning that this is an alcohol. And the alcohol group, the hydroxide group, is on the first carbon, which we see here in the condensed formula. And if we try to put this out into a structural formula, we'd have CH3, a CH2, another CH2, and the OH. So that's taking the condensed version here and expanding it out into the structural formula. Now, there's a few different types of alcohols. Monohydroxy alcohols are going to contain one OH group, seen here on methanol, which is also known as methyl alcohol. It's a one carbon alcohol. It's a very polar alcohol and is therefore the most miscible with water. It's also very poisonous, as are any of these alcohols. Ethanol, otherwise known as grain alcohol or ethyl alcohol, is a 2-carbon alcohol with the hydroxide group on the first carbon. It's the alcohol that's found in alcoholic beverages. It's not as deadly as methanol, but yes, it is still poisonous. 2-propanol, we can see that the hydroxide group moves into the second carbon here. This is otherwise known as isopropyl alcohol or rubbing alcohol, depending on how it's combined with water. The 3-carbon alcohol, where the hydroxyl group is bonded to the second carbon. And this is generally used as an antiseptic, and you can probably find it in your bathroom. Dihydroxy alcohols are going to contain 2 hydroxide groups. 1,2-ethane-diol, which you probably have more experience with than you think, otherwise known as antifreeze, has 2 hydroxide groups on the molecule, one on the first and one on the second carbon. This is very poisonous. It is not an electrolyte. These OHs do not come off of that parent chain. And it's known to cause death and sickness in animals because they want to drink it or ingest it because it does have a sweet taste to it. Trihydroxy, as the name indicates, would have 3 hydroxy groups. So this example here is 1,2,3 propane-triol. The tri telling us that we have 3 alcohols or 3 hydroxy groups. The OL telling us that it's an alcohol. And the numbers in the front of the name indicating where those hydroxy groups are. This is an example of glycerin or glycerol. It's a 3-carbon trihydroxy alcohol that has hydroxyl groups on every carbon. This is a non-toxic substance. You do find it in some foods, and it is used often as a laboratory lubricant. Now, the placement of the functional group can be referred to as primary, secondary, or tertiary, depending on which carbon it is attached to. Primary carbons are attached to only one other carbon, or secondary carbons are attached to 2 other carbons, and tertiary carbons are attached to 3 other carbons. And I think a visual will help this a little bit easier. So primary carbon only connected to one other carbon, and the hydroxy group is bonded to the N carbon in this molecule. A secondary carbon is bonded to 2 other carbons. And in this case, the hydroxy group is bonded to the middle carbon in the molecule, which would be a secondary carbon. The tertiary carbon is going to be bonded to 3 other carbons. So basically, the hydroxyl group is bonded to the middle carbon with a methyl group bonded to it. The carbon is directly bonded to 3 other carbon atoms, making it a tertiary carbon. So we want to be able to identify that based off of how many bonds that center carbon is making with other carbons next to it. The next functional group is organic acids. The group is COOH, and there is a double bond in there. It's a primary carboxyl group. The H that's on the end of that does dissociate. It does come off. So it is considered an acid. And the shorter that this chain is, remember R is indicating a bonded atom or group of atoms. And the shorter that chain is, so something like, let's say methanoic acid, which would be a 1-carbon chain, that's going to be a stronger acid compared to something like propanoic acid, which is going to have 3 carbons. So the shorter that chain, the stronger the acid. the ending of all of these are going to end in oic acid. So we're going to start with the hydrocarbon chain for our names, and we're going to add a suffix onto the end. And each of these carboxyl groups with an organic acid is on primary carbon. So these are going to be at the end of a parent chain. They're not going to be in the middle of a molecule. So this example here is methanoic acid. It's a 1-carbon organic acid responsible for the pain caused by fire ants. 1 carbon, and we have the carboxyl group indicated there. And we should be able to point this out each time. We want to compare that with what you see on the reference table to make sure we're in the correct class of compound. Now this second one here is a 2-carbon organic acid. Feel free to try and name these. You pause the video and try and name them. See if you can get this one. This is ethanoic acid, otherwise known as acetic acid. It is one of my favorite things to eat, drink, I guess. It is a 5% solution in water, which would be known as vinegar. I put vinegar on everything. The H on the rightmost side, this one here, is the one that's going to ionize when it's dissolved in water. Aldehydes. Their functional group looks kind of like a carboxyl group, but we're missing 1 oxygen. So the functional group is a CHO, a primary carbonyl group, not carboxyl, but carbonyl, CHO. And the endings are going to get Al. So if it's an aldehyde, this would normally be propane. We put it in, it becomes propanal. Again, feel free to pause this and try and name these. We have a 1-carbon aldehyde, which would be methanal, otherwise known as formaldehyde, used to preserve biological specimens, tends to not smell the greatest. A 2-carbon aldehyde, using our rules from before, this would be ethanal, which is a 2-carbon aldehyde. Ketones are a secondary form of aldehydes. So now we're going to find this chain, this ketone, in the middle of a molecule as opposed to on the end, on the primary carbon. So it's going to be sandwiched in between 2 different groups of atoms, or somewhere in the middle of a chain. And that's going to help us identify the difference between a ketone and an aldehyde. The ending of the name will get ONE, and will indicate position with the lowest numbered carbon of where that carbonyl group is. Or excuse me, the aldehyde group is. So in this case, we have the ketone attached to a, this would be a secondary carbon. It's going to be on the 2nd carbon in the chain, so it gets the name 2-pentanone. So looking at this one, we have 1, 2, 3 carbons. So this would be pentane, but we have the ketone group in the middle here, which would be propanone, which is acetone, a 3-carbon ketone, which is a very strong solvent. Just use a nail polish. It can be used to dissolve a number of other things. It's an excellent solvent to be used for a lot of different things. It is highly volatile though, so be careful. Esters are formed from carboxyl groups, COO, which is surrounded by 2 radicals. This is going to look similar to an organic acid, but it's going to be in the middle of a molecule as opposed to the end. These are responsible for odors and flavors. You will see different esters, especially in manufactured candies and foods, as these esters are oftentimes made in the lab and used to produce scents and flavors for a variety of different goods. The ending we're going to get here is O8 on the secondary carbon. And we'll use that in coordination with our parent chain. So this first one, we have pentyl ethanoate. And we have the ester portion here, ethanoate, which is going to be right there, and our pentyl, which is coming off of the pentane chain. So we get pentyl ethanoate by reacting pentanol with ethanoic acid. So normally we'd have ethanoic acid, which would have a hydrogen here, and pentanol, which would have a OH off the end of this. And when we combine these two together, we synthesize this in a process known as dehydration synthesis, which we have learned about. We connect these two together and we remove a water in the process, and that'll join our ethanoic acid and our pentanol to produce pentyl ethanoate and ester. So reacting an alcohol with an organic acid will produce an ester. Amines are one of our two groups that have nitrogen in the formula, and it's going to have 3 attached radicals to it. And generally, 2 of the radicals are almost always a hydrogen, and which means the other one would be another group of atoms, generally the parent hydrocarbon chain. The ending of these are going to be named with amine, indicating nitrogen, and we'll use a number in the front of the name that'll indicate where that nitrogen is located. As long as we have 3 or more carbons on that parent chain. Otherwise, we can't have any isomers, which we're going to learn about in a second. So amines, ending is going to get amine, and we have a 4-carbon hydrocarbon. So this would be butane. We put the ending on there. This becomes butanamine, and we want to indicate where that nitrogen is. And in this case, I drew 4-butanamine, but we can just label this the other way, and now it's on the first. We're responsible for how we number those. Amides is the other functional group that's going to have a nitrogen in it, and I think that's one of the easier ways to identify some of these, is looking to see if we do have nitrogen in there. This will help you rule out a couple of those. It's formed from a primary carbon. So this functional group is going to be on the end of a molecule, and the carbon-oxygen bond is going to be a double bond. And that's one of the giveaways of this functional group. The name will end in amide, and generally this prime radical is going to be another hydrogen. And this part will be where we connect to a longer hydrocarbon chain. So again, always start off with numbering your parent chain, longest unbroken chain. This is a 4-carbon hydrocarbon, so it's a butane. They're all single bonded, and we have an amide on the end here with the double bonded oxygen. So this becomes butanamide. This last one is not on table R, and you're not particularly responsible for it as far as the reagents, but wanted to share this since it is applicable right now. So amino acids contain an amine or an NH2 on one end of the molecule and a carboxyl group from an organic acid on the other end of the molecule. And these amino acids, which are organic compounds, are going to form DNA, RNA, and proteins. So just a quick example of what one would look like. We have the amine group here on the end, and we have the carboxyl group here. This is glycine. Now, isomers, some families are going to share functional groups, so they can be isomers of each other. Isomers are going to be substances that have the same molecular formula, but they're put together in a different structural arrangement, different than isotopes, where isotopes would be atoms that have different numbers of neutrons, but the same numbers of protons. So alcohols and ethers both have one oxygen, so they can be isomers of each other depending on where that oxygen is located. Organic acids and esters both have a carboxyl group. Again, depending on where that carboxyl group is located, in the middle or at the end, it's going to determine if it's an organic acid or an ester. If it is an ester, we would have to react that organic acid with an alcohol. And aldehydes and ketones both have a carbonyl group. Again, depending where it's located, in the middle or the end of the molecule will determine if it's an aldehyde or a ketone. Now, just to verify this, alcohols and ethers, we have 2-propanol, C3H8O, with the OH on the secondary carbon, and methyl ethyl ether, which has the same formula, but looks different. And we have the single bonded oxygen in the middle of the molecule, which indicates the ether, as opposed to that being on the end. Same formula, but a different structural arrangement. And we see that with each of these. Depending on where we put this carboxyl group, it's going to help us determine whether or not it's an ester or an organic acid. Same thing with the aldehydes and ketones. Aldehydes are going to have that double bonded oxygen on the end. Ketones will have that double bonded oxygen in the middle. But same formula, just a different arrangement around the molecule. So what do you need to be able to do? Recognize what family a particular molecule belongs to. We use table R for that. Name simple examples of each kind of family. Use the name in the example on table R to help you name others. And be able to draw isomers of various groups. And for this, make sure you can take a structural formula, write down the molecular formula, and if we can put it into a different arrangement, we can determine that it is an isomer of each other. So we'll do a couple of quick practice problems here. We want to try and identify what the functional group is and name each of these molecules. The first one here, we have 2 carbons, which would be F, and we have this amide group on the end. So this would be ethanamide. We have 1, 2, 3 carbons. So this is a prop chain. They're all single bonds. This is propane. And we have a carboxyl group on the end. So this is an organic acid because of the carboxyl group, and it would be propanoic acid, getting the ending of ic acid. We'll number this the other way. We have this carbonyl group here, and it's on the end, which would indicate, let's say it's in the middle of the molecule, and it seems as if I have this backwards because this group is going to be in the middle here. If this was flipped, I guess it would be different, but this carbon is only connected to the one hydrogen there, which is going to make this the middle of the molecule. It looks like the end, which is why this confused me. So this would be the carbonyl group in the middle of the molecule, which would be an ester. So this is propylmethanoate, and we'll learn in our next lesson how to name that. But we can see then this is a propane chain. So we have, it's kind of the explanation here of our propyl and the methanoate coming off of the 1 carbon chain right here. We'll talk about how we produce those esters with organic acids and alcohol in our next lesson. So again, identifying longest unbroken chain, 1, 2, 3. We have a single bonded oxygen in the middle of the molecule, which is going to indicate an ether, and it's in the middle of 2 different hydrocarbon chains. And we have a 1 carbon group and a 3 carbon group. So one's a meth, one is a prop. So this is methyl propyl ether. The methyl group is to the left of the oxygen, and the propyl group is to the right. Numbering these here, I did this backwards because that's going to put the oxygen on the 3rd carbon. We want to put it on the lowest number, which if we number it this way would put it on the 2nd. So this C double bonded oxygen in the middle of the molecule is going to indicate a ketone. If it were on the end, then it would indicate an aldehyde, but it's in the middle, so it's going to be a ketone. It's on a secondary carbon. And this would be butanone because we have 4 carbons in the longest unbroken chain on the molecule. If you guys have any questions on any of these, make sure you write them down and let me know. Have a great day.